Large-scale warfare did not produce anatomical knowledge because ancient societies sought to understand the human body in the abstract. It produced it because repeated violence forced healers, surgeons, and ritual specialists to confront the same injuries again and again, under conditions that demanded practical responses. What survives in the historical record is not a theory of anatomy, but a residue of observation accumulated under pressure. The battlefield functioned as an unplanned laboratory, generating comparable trauma cases across years and generations, and creating a form of empirical knowledge that was rarely formalized, but nonetheless precise. Research has shown that early anatomical and medical knowledge emerged not from curiosity-driven dissection, which was rare or forbidden in many ancient cultures, but from the convergence of three forces produced by organized warfare: repetitive injury patterns, institutionalized healing roles, and mass mortality that made the internal body visible through wounds, death, and post-mortem practices. The evidence is uneven, often indirect, and frequently misinterpreted by later historians who retrojected modern anatomical categories onto ancient texts. Reconstructing what ancient healers actually knew requires careful attention to material remains, textual genres, and the limits of inference. The first condition, created by warfare, was repetition. Unlike accidental injury, battlefield trauma followed patterns shaped by weapons, formations, and tactics. Archaeological studies of mass graves consistently show clustered injury types, allowing historians to infer both mechanisms of harm and the medical responses they elicited. At the late Bronze Age site of Tollens Valley in northern Germany, dated to around 1250 BCE, skeletal remains show a high frequency of cranial fractures, arrowhead penetrations, and defensive forearm injuries. Similar clustering appears in the mass graves at Himera in Sicily from the early 5th century BCE, where trauma patterns correspond closely to hoplite warfare. Such repetition created what modern epidemiology would call comparable cases, even though no statistical framework existed to formalize them. Comparable cases matter because they allow pattern recognition. A healer confronted with dozens of penetrating thigh wounds caused by bronze spearheads would quickly learn which injuries bled rapidly, which produced infection, and which allowed survival. This knowledge was not abstracted into general theory, but encoded in practice, rules of thumb, and technical vocabulary. The clearest surviving evidence for this process comes from Egypt. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, dated paleographically to around 1600 BCE, but widely regarded as a copy of an Old Kingdom text, possibly composed around 2600–2500 BCE, is the most explicit surgical document from the ancient world. Unlike later Egyptian medical papyri, it avoids incantations and frames injuries in a consistent, case-based format. Each entry begins with a description of the wound, followed by examination, diagnosis, prognosis, and treatment. The cases are overwhelmingly traumatic, including fractures of the skull, dislocations of the jaw, crushed vertebrae, and penetrating chest wounds. Several entries specify injuries incurred by fighting, though the battlefield context is often implicit rather than explicit. One passage describes a cranial fracture in which the bone of his skull is smashed and the brain is exposed, followed by the observation that the fluid of his head flows out. This is not a metaphor, it is an empirical description of cerebrospinal fluid, even though no physiological theory accompanies it. The text distinguishes between cases an ailment I will treat, an ailment I will fight with, and an ailment not to be treated, indicating prognostic reasoning grounded in experience. The anatomical knowledge displayed is practical and spatial rather than systemic. The brain is recognized as a structure with consistency and vulnerability, but not as the seat of cognition, which in Egyptian thought remained associated with the heart. The accumulation of such knowledge depended on institutional continuity. Egyptian military organization created a steady supply of injured bodies and a cadre of specialists trained to respond. Tomb reliefs from the Old Kingdom depict surgeons treating wounds, and titles such as Chief Physician of the Palace suggest formal roles. Embalming practices further exposed internal anatomy, though here historians must be cautious. While embalmers removed organs and manipulated tissues, the degree to which this knowledge crossed into surgical medicine is debated. The Edwin Smith Papyrus shows no explicit reference to mummification techniques, and it is likely that professional boundaries limited knowledge transfer. In Mesopotamia, warfare also produced anatomical familiarity, but its textual expression took a different form. The primary anatomical corpus from Assyria and Babylonia comes not from medical manuals, but from divinatory texts, especially the series known as Barutu. These texts catalogue the appearance of animal organs, particularly the liver, for the purpose of extispacy. At first glance, this might seem irrelevant to medicine. However, scholars such as Francesca Rothberg and Markham Geller have shown that the anatomical precision required for divination presupposed detailed, repeated exposure to internal organs. Warfare contributed to this exposure in two ways. First, sacrificial animals were often killed in military rituals, creating opportunities for standardized observation. Second, war injuries and executions exposed human anatomy in ways that overlapped with animal anatomy, allowing analogical reasoning. The Mesopotamian liver models, some dating to the Old Babylonian period around 1800 BCE, include labeled sections and surface features that reflect systematic observation. While these were used for divination rather than healing, they indicate a culture comfortable with internal anatomical differentiation. Medical texts, such as the Diagnostic Handbook, attributed to Esagilkin Apli in the 11th century BCE, describe symptoms and prognoses linked to internal organs, including the lungs and intestines. The causal reasoning is framed in terms of divine agency, but the symptom clusters reflect real injury patterns, many of which are consistent with trauma. The challenge for historians is to disentangle observational knowledge from interpretive frameworks without assuming that one negates the other. In South Asia, the relationship between warfare and anatomy appears most explicitly in the Sushruta Samhita, a foundational Ayurvedic text traditionally dated to the late 1st millennium BCE, though its layers likely span several centuries. Sushruta is associated with surgery, particularly the treatment of wounds, fractures, and dislocations. The text describes battlefield injuries caused by arrows, swords, and clubs, and prescribes surgical interventions, including extraction of foreign objects, suturing, and cauterization. One of the most striking passages concerns anatomical training. The text instructs students to study the human body by dissecting a corpse that has been placed in flowing water to soften tissues, then scraping away layers with brushes. This is one of the earliest explicit references to systematic human dissection. Whether this practice was widespread or idealized remains uncertain. Archaeological evidence for dissection in ancient India is sparse, and some scholars argue that the passage reflects a pedagogical ideal rather than routine practice. Nonetheless, the text's detailed enumeration of bones, muscles, and vessels suggests prolonged engagement with internal anatomy. Warfare likely provided both the injured bodies and the cultural justification for such study. The surgical sections of the Sushruta Samhita are pragmatic and focused on outcomes, not theory. The body is mapped as a field of intervention, not as an object of philosophical inquiry. This aligns with the broader pattern seen elsewhere. Greek medicine is often credited with the birth of anatomy as a rational discipline, but this attribution requires qualification. Classical Greek medical texts, particularly those in the Hippocratic corpus, dating from the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, display careful observation of wounds and trauma. Treatises, such as On Wounds in the Head, classify cranial injuries according to fracture type and recommend specific interventions. The text describes the use of probes to assess skull fractures, indicating tactile familiarity with bone structure. These texts emerged in a context of near constant warfare among Greek polis. The Peloponnesian War alone generated decades of sustained combat, and hoplite warfare produced predictable injury patterns. Mass graves at sites such as Kerameikos in Athens associated with the plague of 430 BCE, but also containing trauma victims, provide osteological confirmation of these patterns. However, Greek anatomical knowledge remained limited by cultural prohibitions against human dissection. Aristotle conducted animal dissections extensively, but human anatomy was inferred by analogy. The Hellenistic period saw a brief exception. In 3rd century BCE Alexandria, figures such as Herophilus and Erasistratus reportedly performed systematic human dissections and possibly vivisections on condemned criminals. Later authors, including Celsus and Tertullian, attest to this practice, though their accounts are separated by centuries and colored by polemic. Archaeological confirmation is lacking, and the scale of these dissections remains debated. What is clear is that this episode did not produce a lasting anatomical tradition. After Alexandria, human dissection largely disappeared from the Mediterranean world for centuries. Across these cultures, mass death functioned as unintentional data production. Battles, sieges, and their aftermath generated bodies at a scale that overwhelmed ritual norms and exposed internal structures. At sites such as the mass grave at Kadesh on the Orontes, associated with the battle between Egyptians and Hittites around 1274 BCE, skeletal remains show perimortem injuries consistent with chariot warfare. In medieval and early modern contexts, similar patterns would later underpin the rise of a battlefield surgery, but the ancient evidence already shows the mechanism at work. Why, then, did this knowledge remain practical rather than theoretical? The answer lies in institutional priorities and epistemic frameworks. Ancient medical practitioners were judged by outcomes, not by explanatory models. Healing was embedded in social roles, whether as court physicians, temple specialists, or itinerant surgeons. There was little incentive to abstract anatomical observations into universal principles, especially when explanatory authority was claimed by cosmology or theology. Moreover, the tools required for systematic theory building, such as standardized measurement and controlled experimentation, were absent. Later, historiography misattributed the origins of anatomy by privileging texts that aligned with modern scientific values. Renaissance anatomists, such as Vesalius, framed their work as a revival of classical knowledge, selectively citing Greek sources while dismissing non-Greek traditions as unscientific. This narrative obscured the fact that much anatomical familiarity predated theoretical anatomy and arose from contexts that left fragmentary records. Egyptian papyri, Mesopotamian omen texts, and Indian surgical manuals were either unknown or undervalued by early modern scholars. Modern historians reconstruct this lost knowledge through a triangulation of sources: textual analysis, archaeological context, and bioarchaeological data. Trauma patterns in skeletons are compared with textual descriptions of injuries. Tool marks on bones are analyzed for surgical intervention. Burial practices are examined for evidence of post-mortem manipulation. Each line of evidence is incomplete on its own. Together, they allow cautious inference. The picture that emerges is not one of ignorance awaiting enlightenment, but of competence constrained by context. Ancient warfare produced bodies, injuries, and deaths in numbers sufficient to generate empirical anatomical knowledge. That knowledge circulated within practical domains and rarely crystallized into theory. Recognizing this does not diminish later anatomical science. It clarifies its preconditions. The anatomy that eventually entered textbooks was built on centuries of unacknowledged observation, much of it born not in lecture halls, but in the aftermath of battle. In reconstructing this history, the task is not to celebrate violence as a source of knowledge, nor to impose modern categories on ancient practices, but to understand how material conditions shape what can be known, recorded, and transmitted. The ancient battlefield was not a place of discovery by design. It was a site where the internal body became visible, repeatedly and unavoidably, and where knowledge emerged because someone had to respond.